Welcome to the Great Barrier Reef. Before we get into too much detail about the reef, we are going to do a quick reminder about how coral reefs form. Coral reefs begin to form when free-swimming coral larvae attach to submerged rocks or other hard surfaces along the edges of islands and continents. As the corals grow and expand, these reefs begin to take one of three major characteristic structures. They become either fringing, barrier, or atoll. So this process is an exponential process, meaning that it happens over time and it gets bigger and bigger naturally. Okay, so now that we have a quick reminder about that, we're going to talk about the Great Barrier Reef in more detail. So the Great Barrier Reef is located along the western coast of Australia. As you can see from this picture, it's taking up about half the length of the western coast of Australia, which lets us know that it's pretty darn big. Exactly how big is it though? Well, the Great Barrier Reef takes up about the size of about 70 million football fields. It is nearly 2,300 kilometers, and it can be seen from outer space. So we know it is the largest living structure on the planet, taking up about nearly half the size of the state of Texas. Due to its large size, we know that it's incredibly rich and diverse. It's mostly known for its maze of colorful reefs, and its intricate architecture also provides a home for for such a large number of plants and of animals. So, because of its large size, you're probably going to guess that it has more than one ecosystem located inside of the Great Barrier Reef. So, all along the different parts of the Great Barrier Reef, there are about 14 different coastal ecosystems that are important to the function of the reef. So we have the coral reefs, the lagoon floor, islands, open water, seagrasses, coastlines, estuaries, freshwater wetlands, forested floodplain, heath and shrublands, grass and sagelands, woodlands, forests, and rainforest. So all of those ecosystems depend on the Great Barrier Reef. So the Great Barrier Reef is its own ecosystem, as well as all of these smaller communities that are all within the Great Barrier Reef. So these 14 ecosystems provide important links between land, freshwater, and marine environments. They provide feeding grounds, breeding grounds, and so much more for so many different marine species. So the ecosystems provide a range of ecological services that are supported by the Great Barrier Reef. So these systems include water distribution, food and habitat, as well as nutrient and chemical cycling. So as we can see, the Great Barrier Reef is incredibly biodiverse. It has a great amount of biodiversity. So it's recognized for its outstanding biodiversity all around the world. In fact, the World Heritage status of the reef recognizes its great diversity of its species and habitats, and we understand that conserving the reef is incredibly important. It's not only desired, but it's also essential to maintaining the overall environment that it holds. So imagine the reef with fewer species, no variety, and as you can tell, it would just be a very different place. It would not be able to sustain all that it does today. So biodiversity is a term that we use to describe the variety of life on Earth at all of its levels, from genes to ecosystems, and the ecological and evolutionary processes that sustain it. So it includes all living things, from the small microbes and single-cell algae to the giant whales and marine turtles and all of their habitats. So it's not just a measure of how many species are there, rather it encompasses all natural variation, from genetic differences within one species to variations across a habitat or an entire ecosystem. It relies on the biodiversity in its own Great Barrier Reef, from the animals, plants, and algae to the microorganisms too small for the eye to see. So every single piece of this puzzle is incredibly important to the overall success of the biodiversity. So why is biodiversity in general important? Well, biodiversity is important because it is directly linked to an environment sustainability. So it's been shown that the biodiversity of an area has a large impact on the ecosystem's ability overall. So its stability relies on it exclusively. So areas with high levels of species and genetic diversity are likely to have a more complex ecosystem. So all of the parts of an ecosystem, such as its food webs and its interactions, those are all going to be more complex with with higher levels of biodiversity. So in case something happens, like a tragic event, um, an ecosystem is more likely to survive if it has more complexity, because it will be able to bounce back quicker. So any disturbance is not as catastrophic when you have an ecosystem that is more highly diverse. So what about all the animals in the Great Barrier Reef? Well, the Great Barrier Reef has an enormous amount of animals and species living within it, as we talked about with biodiversity. But more specifically, we have we have over 1,600 species of fish in the Great Barrier Reef alone. There's 630 species of echinoderm, which are starfish and sea urchins. We have 14 species of sea snakes, which is terrifying. I don't want to be around all those sea snakes. There's 215 species of birds. There's 6 of the world's 7 species of marine turtle are present on the Great Barrier Reef, and nearly 30 species of different whales and dolphins. There are also so many sharks and rays there, nearly 135 species of them, and there is so much more that's present. So all the islands and the cays along the Great Barrier Reef support all of these different species. So it's not just the marine species that are supported here. Think about all the species that live on land and are affected, that live on the islands around and are affected by the biodiversity within the water as well. So what makes the Great Barrier Reef so special? Well, not only is it so large, but it's such an interesting amount of animals and species and land features all in one place. So we talked about earlier that it has the 14 different ecosystems. So that's not even just 14 populations, that is 14 individual ecosystems that are all interrelated and interlinked. And the concept that biodiversity is linked to sustainability is so present here. We see it so easily, because if something terrible happens to a single population, because it encompasses so many different species and populations, the overall Great Barrier Reef is not going to be as largely affected as if it was a more isolated, or if all these species were in more isolated groups. But that's what makes the Great Barrier Reef so special, is that it's so closely linked to one another. And also think about all the unique species that are located here. Obviously, these are just marine species or land species, but think about how different they could be from the fish swimming around in the lake near you, or the fish in Galveston Bay, or the fish in the tank in our own classroom. All of these species are so different because they've evolved to meet the adaptations, or to acquire the adaptations that are necessary to survive in this environment. So it's just really an awesome community that is so massive and so rich in species. So I hope you enjoyed exploring the Great Barrier Reef and learning all that it has to offer, and we will see you later.